Hi, Dom. Welcome to Ideology.
Thanks for having me, Saf. Great to be here.
Dom, I wanted to talk to you because, we've just come from a global pandemic. We have energy scarcity, rapid inflation, geopolitical tension. And I just thought, who's the best person to talk to who can, have a sober conversation with us about where we're going than Mr. Future Gov, Mr. Impossible Ideas. So
No pressure then. No pressure to talk about the big stuff.
can we start with, one of the things that the trends that came from the pandemic was a lot of people were resigning from their jobs, the great resignation. And people have become used to some form of work-life balance, working from home, hybrid, but there's discussion that employers are going to be quite strict and maybe even take the Elon Musk approach of everybody has to be in the office and everybody should go back to working the hours that employers expected before the pandemic. Can you give us some commentary on what that is for future work? Do you
Yeah,
think that's going to happen?
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think you're right that the trend is accelerating, and I think it's hard to distinguish a lot of the time between when is it a corporate need and when is it just individual preference. Because I mean, it certainly feels that way with Elon Musk, but it's true of all of us. I think that we'll all have very strong. It's amazing. I think it's shown how viscerally important it is to all of us as individuals in a way that was almost not allowed to be talked about before. It just wasn't a thing. And even if you wanted to do it, it involved negotiations and an awful lot of work to get the flexibility into your life that you wanted. Whereas employee power has definitely risen hugely in the last couple of years. And I think we're in this place now where it's about negotiation, and I don't think employers are particularly great at taking negotiated positions and trying to see their teams as individuals or groups of individuals rather than just the simple, there's one way to do everything. Because I think almost in some respects, on a personal level, I prefer a couple of days in the office, 2 or 3 days in the office would be my preference. But to then say, therefore, everybody in the world must go back to the office 2 or 3 days a week because I like that. I don't think that's going to work. So, yeah, I think we're in this place where, for me, designing our organizations over again in a way that is in discussion with our teams. And trying to get to more than just the black and white of, home in front of Zoom or in the office in front of Zoom, which is often what's happening, to be honest. There has to be a different way.
You and your wife have both got, high-powered careers or careers that are very demanding, and you also have a very young family. So you're a husband and a dad. How do you manage the whole work-life balance?
Yeah, I mean, the same challenges as everybody, I would imagine. It would be wrong for me not to recognize my privileges in terms of being able to work in a career that pays well, to be able to get really great support outside of the house. So I need to say that from the beginning, because that's not afforded to everybody. But I think outside of that, it was a commitment that me and my wife made to each other from the very beginning. Was, everything we do is a partnership. And I was reading an article from Michelle Obama on the weekend, which was quite interesting actually, because in the way she described it was, instead of viewing life as a seesaw where sometimes you're winning, sometimes you're losing, and you've got to make very strong decisions who's going to give up a decade for the other person. Actually, it's slightly more like an abacus where everything's constantly shifting, There's no, it doesn't have to be, this is your decade, this is my decade. It's a matter of, where can you, again, sort of design your lives and around each other's careers, which are often in slightly different modes at different times. We were lucky in the pandemic that whilst I was having to manage a 200-person organization remotely and get us and helping local authorities and others to survive the pandemic, my wife was in a relatively small startup, able to take the load slightly more then, but recognizing now we live in the States and she's got a job in the US government, and so I'm trying to take the load a bit more now. So I think it's a matter of just recognizing that, and I would hope that men in my generation increasingly recognize that, because there's no take from women unless men are willing to give. We've got to be willing to lean out at times, whereas I'm not seeing enough of that. It's no more true that men can have their cake and eat it than women can, and it's all about that kind of abacus and that discussion, I think.
In the social media space, I don't know how much you're aware of it, but so I feel almost like there's different generations are having different conversations. So I think you're a Gen X, right? So I'm Gen X. Oh, you're millennial, actually.
Well, I'm 1980, so like right on the line, I think.
Okay, so I'm 77, and so definitely considered Gen X. But so I think they see them as older millennials, and so I feel that those of us who have grown up around like mid 80s and 70s grew up with a different set of values. Those values for women were you have to be everything. You have to be great at your career, and you have to have a family, and you have to look good all the time. And it was just impossible, miss perfect. Whereas I feel like the younger generations are a lot more pragmatic, and the discussions they're having about gender and family. I hear young women who say, no, I have to have a man who understands that I have to be at home for a certain period of time. But with that comes a different type of pressure. Not every man will be able to earn the income to support a family. Not all families can afford to support on one income. And so, and then there's the other discussion of younger men who feel that, who have almost gone back to traditional values, where they see masculinity, a man pushing the pram and a man doing so-called female mother type roles, as not really a man. They actually have terms for all this, but I feel like I'm too old to keep up with all the terms that are coined.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it represents like the wider flux, I guess, whether it's around gender identity, whether it's around race or any other issue that we're talking about at the moment in the world, is almost this a big realignment going on around, what do you feel? Is it like, what are you allowed to feel? How are you meant to talk about things? And I think there's a lot in flux in all of that. And as you say, there are some very strong opinions, both from progressive camps, which sort of put pressure on you in one way, and in conservative camps in a different way. So, and you're kind of trapped in the middle, trying to work out, who am I in the middle of all of that? My wife went through exactly what you were describing, in the sense that with our first child, she was very much like, I've got to get back to work. Like, this can't damage my career. I've essentially been told that, like, felt made to feel that. She started working again after 4 months, which in Europe is obviously relatively quick, whereas in the States that's probably 2 months longer than most people. Yeah. But nevertheless was very much, and then recognized that and realized it's okay, and it's okay to be a mum, but then also to work, and together that balance, I think. And so she took a year with our second child in order to be like, I'm not going to, we're not going to do it again. It was our second and last, and I may as well, really try and enjoy it and accept who I am and forget those pressures. And I totally see that. And then I tried to, with both children, I tried to take decent amounts of time off, but fell for the pressure of being the boss of a company and ended up not taking huge chunks of time off. I took most of my time out, but in sort of long weekends and bits and pieces. And, for all I wanted to be the sort of perfect modern father, found that balance quite difficult as well. And so, yeah, I think it's that sort of conversation in your head all the time at the moment, whether because of what you're reading on social media or who you're hanging out with or whatever it is, to feel like you should be X in any given identity and any given angle. And I think those lines are being redrawn, and they're hard.
Mm-hmm. So speaking to the younger generation about what it does to your psyche, I always thought I was very spiritual, for example, and I could handle these things better than people, but I underestimated the extent that a loss of identity can lead you as a human being to suffer. So when, for example, let's say you grew up in a very traditional part of the UK, right? And in a very traditional family, do you understand the young men who say that we're being feminized into accepting a female worldview?
I mean, I have sympathy and curiosity for pretty much everybody's point of view. It doesn't mean I necessarily subscribe to it. I feel like, I mean, I was lucky. I grew up in a house with two sisters, one older and one younger, and there's no doubt that makes a difference in my mind. Like you can't mentally go down certain avenues when all you've known is being surrounded by women. You'd just be totally perverse if I then was to say, it's not manly to be a certain way or whatever. But at the same time, like, I do see it wrapped up in the wider thing around, like, who am I? Like, what is my role? The pressure you were talking about earlier around, like, on the one hand, I don't want to be feminized, but on the other hand, the pressure of, employment and money and supporting people. There's the sort of lad culture, around, drinking and football and whatever else, and the pressure to fit in with other men. And when are together, they tend to sort of norm towards a certain perception of what men should behave like and be like. And so there's all of that going on, and I totally understand it to some degree. On the other hand, I would just say it's a sort of laziness and a sort of like patriarchy fights back, in the sense that, like, so basically what you're saying is you don't want to do the hard work, right? Like, I've been looking after my kids predominantly in our partnership the last 18 months, and I can absolutely say it is far harder work than work. And there's and so in many ways I feel like I have sympathy, but I also think it's a laziness and a desire to get out of doing your bit.
Yeah. No, I had a colleague who used to tell me that she used to work for someone who would literally stay in the office doing nothing till like 8, just long enough that the wife has...
I knew someone like that as well, and I just couldn't believe that they admitted it to me. But again, it was in one of those lad environments down the pub where he thought he was being funny, and I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And so, yeah, I hope that, I mean, the thing is, like, when we're in the UK, we live in Hackney in London, and you would hope that areas like that tend to be sort of setting the standard for the future. And so, they tend to be the sort of Brooklyns of the world or the whatever, where, you've got people testing new social norms and very liberal places. But even there, I remember one day pushing my kid in the pram, counting on a Thursday morning how many men were pushing prams,
Yeah.
through the park, and I reckon it was about 1 in 30.
Yeah.
And if that's a place that's meant to be defining the future, then we've got a hell of a long way to go.
Yeah. I think for a brief window, and I remember actually it was 2019, just before the pandemic, I'd go into meetings and the dads would, well, oh, I have to leave because I'm going to my child's play. I have to do this. And sorry, it's just saying when it runs out, we're going to have to log back in quickly. But yeah, so they were almost proudly showing you that they're modern men. But I feel like now that's almost gone, and they've realized, okay, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. We
Yeah,
tried it.
yeah, it hasn't become, yeah, I just think, yeah, progress isn't linear, is it? It's definitely, it jumps backwards and forwards. And I do think a lot of men had a shock. And a lot, I'll be honest, me too. Like, I particularly around homeschooling was an absolute nightmare, and I was over the moon to not do it again. But that's almost beyond all of this in some respects. Like, I'm just a really bad teacher. Like, I'm just not made for teaching.
I don't think any parents are. Maybe some who are even actual teachers will admit to you that it's actually really hard to teach your own child.
Right,
Um,
that's interesting.
so, in terms of like the future of work, what do you think is going to happen with the economy and with everything that's happening? Do you feel that employers are going to insist that everybody goes back to work, say, not maybe fully hybrid and maybe not 5 days, but 4 days? That kind of thing, what impact would that have? Because I feel like our values have completely changed now.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to totally answer that because I'm predominantly in sort of government world. But talking in that world, there's a real challenge going on in the sense that Brexit has brought massive workforce pressures in the public sector. And so you then layer on top of a shortage of labour,
Mhm.
uh, then a belief, or a sort of an evidenced belief, that they find it really hard now to push anybody to do anything that leads to. So if you're not in a place that has a ready availability of people with the right skills, you really do increasingly have to just say, fine, I'd rather you worked 5 days a week from the other end of the UK than not have anybody at all.
Yeah,
And they're facing that kind of challenge. It's either let me do whatever I want, or you're not going to have somebody in that position.
right.
And so when you're facing that kind of pressure, I just don't think it'll be a simple thing going um, back to normal. I just don't think it's possible because people just aren't willing to do it anymore. I think people have just really woken up to, yeah. I mean, I hear more people than ever say, very literally, it's given me a sense of my own mortality. Like, sod this. Why would I do that? I'll just go and work for an employer who lets me do what I want to do.
But is that there? So this is the thing. The statistics say that about 73% of new employers in the new year are thinking of, putting a stop to it and really increasing the pressure on employees. So is it going to be like a monopoly type of thing where all employers decide we're going to have to, instead of like we are all facing retention problems, and we're going to have to really tighten the advantages that labor have over us?
Yeah.
Because I
I
agree.
think it's an interesting one. Like Boris, some of it's like signaling, though, isn't it? Like trying to ratchet up the marketing pressure on people to be like, "This is coming, this is coming." But Boris Johnson was doing that right at the beginning of the pandemic, even because the landowners and office owners were wanting people back.
Yeah.
But that's had, we're what, 2 years, 2.5 years in now, and that's had relatively trivial impacts. Like I
Hmm.
can see it happening in certain places and in certain industries, like the City of London, the legal profession, like often where you've got that advantage actually, where people are already living close to the offices that they were working in, because
Yeah.
it's actually not that big a deal for them. But
Yeah.
increasingly, like where there are workforce shortages, I really just don't think that they're going to have, and also I don't think they're going to have that kind of advantage where it's almost like a mutual understanding between the employer and the employee. But yeah, because there is, you look at rent in London, you look at, the cost of living in most places now.
Mm-hmm.
People just haven't got that flexibility that they used to move to new places for jobs. I don't see it. I think it'll be a really mixed picture.
You kind of work in tech, but also in government. Do you notice differences politically and culturally in the UK and the US?
Hugely. I think in the UK and Europe, we tend to start with an assumption that government is good, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Whether certain factions would be willing to say it quite like that is different, but I think we do. And I think if you think of a triangle, we view government as like the foundation to our society to some degree, and it's just an assumed it'll always be there, it'll always function, it'll always give us what we need. In the US, it's not like that. It's much more like the moon or a distant planet circulating a huge planet called the economy. And the only purpose of government is to ensure that the economy succeeds. And most of the time it just gets in the way. And they also confuse government delivery, public services, with politics. And so when they say government in the US, they mean the people on the Hill in DC who are just fighting and getting in the way of average Americans' life and not doing anything for them. There's not much nuance then to say, but I'm really grateful for public services. I appreciate my teacher. I appreciate my doctor. Because one, so much of it is privatized, and two, there is no real understanding, nuance, or respect about what government is, I think, in the US. And then on top of that, then, when you start thinking about government technology and other stuff, they assume government will be broken and not work for them here. Whereas I think we're fairly, so at the moment, I'm just applying for a driving license in the US, and it involves clicking 5 links to get to a PDF, which I then have to print off and fill in with hand, which to a Brit or a European is mind-blowing in 2022. But they just accept that because they think government is that. Government's broken, government hates me, government gets in the way of life. It just reinforces.
But what do you think their government is broken though? Because sometimes when I've only started watching it for a couple of years, and I think it's broken.
I think the model of governance in America means it will diminish. It will diminish in the world. The federal, state, local system, the way that DC is totally locked, the way that the Supreme Court is now locked for the next 20 or 30 years with the people that are in it because they've appointed people who are in their early 50s and their lifetime appointments. Like there's so many aspects of it that they dedicate to be an American in government is to dedicate your life to hacking bureaucracy and doing whatever you can to just get some small wins because the big wins are too elusive. Whereas like the concept of like renewing your passport online like we have in the UK and it takes 3 days on a good week to get your passport in the post.
Yeah.
It's beyond the comprehension and imagination of an average American because it's just the government doesn't do that. Like it's not.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's
unbelievable when you put it down to those very personal things that we take for granted.
100%, 100%. And I do think it's going to catch up with America quite fast. And I'll be interested to see. Everything's pushing in a sort of states' right direction over here at the moment, meaning that they want to give governors all the power over abortion rights or anything else. And again, what is a country if it doesn't have an opinion on things like that? And so at what point does America become more like the EU than it is a single country if it carries on that path?
What do you think are some cultural things that you have noticed that are different?
In terms of the way that government works or in terms of...
just culture-wise, what was, for example, a culture shock for you?
Oh, okay, yeah. So, I mean, so many things, I think. It's just the everyday stuff, the way that you interact with people, the things that you talk about. I think, we're quite used in the UK to people having different versions of English, and we're quite able to tune our ear to accents and to, not perfect Queen English sentences. Whereas in the US, if you don't talk with a certain accent, using exactly an agreed set of words almost that Americans use for certain things, people just stare at you like you're an alien. So there's not that generosity. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not trying to work it out with you. You mean a trash can? And I'm like, I don't know. Is that what I mean? Like, like there's no generosity in that way. It's just very much like you're left hanging. Like, anyway, strange English guy. So I find that strange, which is interesting because I live in DC and it's a very international city, but it's also very. You've got, if LA is where all the beautiful people of America go, in DC it's possibly the ugly people / the people who are very much the policy wonks and a certain personality type on the one hand, and then on the other hand you've got like the very long-standing traditional Black community here as well, who are often very separated out from the opportunities that come from being in DC. You've got these extremely highly paid government jobs, very stable, very long lasting, but actually there's a massive disconnect between the white and international communities and actually the local Black community.
That's something I think that is I'm going to say still taking me a very long time to process. I think because we all grew up with American culture and we grew up watching their movies, you think you know America and you think that actually they've influenced us more than we know. So every single time I've traveled to the US, I've realized how different we are. We're not as segregated in this country. Race relations are not the same here as they are there. And what have you found is the stark difference that makes us so different?
I think it's a starting point where, and maybe it's because we would like to position ourselves as sort of post-colonial and slightly moving on. I would love it if we accepted some of the reality of our history a bit more explicitly as Brits, but nevertheless, we do, I think, try and move beyond it. Whereas I think very much America's still a imperial colonial power in its heyday. And I think that shows, really. I think they struggle to talk about the now and the reality. The last slave-owning senator, formerly slave-owning senator, left Capitol Hill only 100 years ago. So, it's very, very now. It's whereas I think it's the pretense of it being a distant memory is almost harmful, because actually to a lot of people in America, particularly Black people, it's actually not a distant memory. Like, it's the great grandparents. It's people who they feel and they have photos on their wall of, and yet everybody else is going on as if either nothing ever happened or it wasn't such a big deal, and therefore doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that there needs to be that explicit recognition and discussion, whereas I feel in Britain we tend to be able to take the piss out of each other, like be slightly curious about each other's cultures, and get things wrong probably as well as a result, like, and tell each other off for getting it wrong, and then hopefully learning from that and moving forward. Yeah. Whereas I don't feel the same in the US. I feel like it's very much walking on eggshells and sort of surviving conversations by comparison.
For me, one of the things I found whenever I met Americans here, there was a time when I first moved to the UK, I used to work in a hotel that had mostly American guests, and they would come and just tell you about the American celebrities. So I'd be checking in someone and they would say, "Oh my God, how about that Jamie Foxx?" and I would just think,
why are we talking about this?
Like, hey, I love Jamie Foxx, you know?
Yeah, it's
And
almost like that, exactly right. But then, quite rightly, there is that whole belief over here that there is the sort of objectification of the physical and showbiz nature of Black people compared to the respect and intelligence and true equals. And you do see exceptions from that for sure, but it's partly a numbers game, right? Like it's hard to remember when you're in London, I think, that the UK is actually not that diverse, really.
yeah,
When you're out and about, it just is when you're in parts of London that we know. Whereas in the US, it is pretty diverse in most places.
mm,
And so there are when people do then say, I don't face racism, or it's like a land of opportunity for anybody and everyone, it's partly a numbers game. It's partly just law of averages
uh,
because there are more people from different backgrounds that some will get through to the top and succeed. But
yeah,
actually, if you look at it in real percentage terms, it's definitely no better of sort of more senior positions in the
yeah.
US than it is in the UK. Those fundamentals of structural racism exist in both countries almost identically, I think.
Yeah. But I think one thing I've become aware of is the fact that a lot of people who they say have done okay or are living the so-called American dream sometimes aren't American. They are actually Africans who moved to America.
Very true.
And conflating these two things, it helps them not really address the fact that actually where is the social mobility for those ones who are born there?
Totally, and I think this, yeah, exactly. And if you look at the West Coast, a lot of South Asians run a lot of the tech companies who have come over from India and elsewhere. Like it's totally, as you say, it's a very good point. But I do think there's a wider education language issue that I find here, and again, I'm not saying Britain has got this nailed, but another conversation I really struggle to have is around like sort of left-wing intellect, like almost academic left-wing thinking. And I would say to somebody, just almost like try and wind them up at a party and be like, but you've read Marx, right? So you've got an understanding of sort of social mobility and the class system, and they're almost like, one, we don't have a class system, which is obviously rubbish, and two,
They don't think they have a class system in the US or
in the
no?
US, they absolutely don't believe they have a class system. And so one, they'll say we don't have a class system, and two, it's almost like the forbidden fruit to talk about something like Marx and reading the Communist Manifesto. And I'm like, look, I'm not seeking to overturn your American capitalism, although I do have some opinions on it. But I think it's okay to take a Marxist critique of stuff and actually try and use it to analyze your
Yeah,
society and where there are things going wrong and the lack of social mobility and other things. But it's just not done. Like it's seen as a very sort of edgy, risky conversation to be a part of. And it isn't at all part of the education system here to actually think about. Everything is just accepted, I would say, in America. Just everything is accepted, both the sort of national narrative, the standing up at a baseball game to put your hand on your heart and take your baseball cap off, even though there's a supposed separation of church and state, and the country acts as if it is a religion. The sort of lack of critique of the American culture or economics is huge. Whereas, like, I think as a Brit, it's second nature. Maybe we take it too far sometimes and we struggle to see the good in things, but we're certainly very comfortable critiquing things, I think, which just isn't the case here at all.
I think what I'm coming to notice actually here in the UK, sometimes I feel like it's those of us who have adopted the country are starting to appreciate it sometimes more than native born Brits,
Quite possible.
because, most of us come from Commonwealth countries. And so we have seen that, in this country, we've been taken in, especially those of us who came later, obviously, who the people who came in the 60s, or that was a different time. And I feel like we're seeing that type of progress, whereas in America now, I feel what you've said is true, but only partly because I've been for the last 3 years listening mostly to the right. And they're the ones who are saying, look, we need to unify around a the patriotic ideals, because the alternative in a country this diverse is what,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's just tribal camps. And so in some ways, when you see the socialists and the ones who like Bernie or Cortez, in some ways you can kind of see how they also take it to the other extreme, and nobody is doing what you're suggesting, which is whether you're taking Marx or you're taking an idea like patriotism, you're using it as a test to just look at society. It doesn't become your new religion.
Totally, totally, and I think that's exactly what I've struggled with the most in the last 6 years. You know, I was on, we had Brexit, and then I went on the Hillary Clinton campaign directly afterwards, and then lost that. So it was a fun year, 2016, but I feel like that is where we've lost it a bit, and there isn't. Gordon Brown at one point dabbled with the sort of our diversity is our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And in trying to do a modernized patriotism
Mm-hmm.
rather than one that only looks back to Churchill and only looks back to the way the world was for Britain in an era where most of us now feel a degree of shame, I would imagine. And so therefore don't want it to just be about rallying around the flag and the sort of mistakes of the past, but actually say, okay, we've got to move forward. And as you say, look at the strength of, which is why I think so many of us struggle with what's going on in terms of asylum seekers and refugees as well. And you tell me, I would imagine it feels uncomfortable more so for people like yourself than anyone, in the sense that is this how we want to treat people? Is this not part of our identity to be welcoming? I don't know.
You know how I've come to see that, and I hate to even admit this. In 2007, so I moved here in 2001. In 2005, I was working for Channel 4. In around, I think, 2007, I was given an opportunity to go review a play by Richard Bean at the National Theatre. It was called English People Very Nice. And the whole play was how each generation of migrants that come actually resent the new migrants.
Interesting.
And so it showed you, for example, the Caribbeans, and then now they're having to fight for public resources with a new generation, whether that's the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis or the Somalis, who are at the time the latest.
Yeah.
And I came out of it with a freshy mindset. I said, migrants, we don't have time to think about any of this. We're just trying to send remittances, and we still have ties back home, and we're trying to fight our way through and work all these hours so that we can learn the new skills we need to do while supporting our families. That's where our priorities lie. But that was my perspective. So in terms of what you're working on, Impossible Ideas, tell me a little bit about that.
So I guess I've spent 20 years trying to polish very old-fashioned organizations and bend them into being a bit more 21st century. And you can see that in government, that there's plenty of successes. We were talking about driving licenses and passports earlier, but there's still so many bits of it that are fundamentally broken. And so instead of pretending that we can turn Victorian institutions into 21st century organizations, I've moved on from more consulting work to more how might we start bits of government from scratch in the 21st century with much less overhead, with much better technology, with much better citizen experience. And so we're using Impossible Ideas to sort of invent new public ventures. And the first one off the block is a foster care agency, and helping people become foster carers, and doing it in a very different way to appeal to a different audience, and make it much easier for people to contribute in that way, I guess. But it's a vehicle that we're using hopefully in the future in social housing, in climate change, in those really problematic areas that old-fashioned ways of working and thinking just haven't solved the problems. And let's try starting from scratch.
If you could influence the world in any way, what would you say is something that you would like to see done that you think would make the biggest difference in like people's quality of life?
For me, I think, gosh, that's a big question. So many things. I think in my world in particular, I think it would be a matter of trying to bring together a really diverse group in every sense, from technologists to people who are most in need of public services and others, together with some really meaningful investment from the great and the good, from government, from wherever, to really try and dig under some of the fundamental and almost work through it like a really deliberate to-do list, and we've got to stop children living in homes that are full of mold in modern Britain. So let's get that off the list. We've really got to legislate for green energy solutions in homes across the UK and make sure that there's no new build houses that aren't solar generated, and really take a very serious, very almost like nation building, this is our moment, setting up the NHS style, 1945 commission towards saying that was the past, this is the future. How do we really all come together to try and deliver on that change?
That sounds really grand. But as someone who's spent a lot of time on listening to the voices on the right, I've noticed there is literally no issue that is not politicized, including the green economy, green solutions, everything like that. How do you break through so that you get everybody to see the importance of what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt we've got a media issue in the UK. Like, it's very hard for us to get to a point where things are just talked about in a fairly straightforward, fact-based way, because I really deeply believe that the majority of Brits are in that spot. They're in the purple patch in the middle. That are beyond the politicization of everything. I
agree with you in terms of the Brits, but I don't know if I agree with you when it comes to Americans.
No, I think I'm quite pessimistic about it here. It's interesting because I'm married to an American. I think I have an appreciation for America, particularly because I'm relatively optimistic, I think, and at times I feel like Britain isn't optimistic enough. But I've come to realize I'm in between. I'm almost floating over the Atlantic, because there's a blind optimism that America is great and America can save itself and everything will be fine, which I don't believe. And it takes real, deliberate, hard work to get there. You can't just wish it to be true. And Americans are very good at blind optimism. But then equally, I think in Britain, we can sometimes have blind pessimism and say, like, it hasn't worked before, or why would we try, or it's too difficult. And so I find myself straddling those two cultures in quite a painful way of sort of like optimistic realism, which is like, we can, and we will, and we've got to believe it, but it has some hard work and some real stuff to be done.
You know what? It's so funny you say that, because as we're doing this, I've just been reminded, this is my Obama cup. I literally brought it out to remind you. This is the thing. I think both of us were, from that era where we came aware politically in the time of hope and change and all of that. But I was told by a mutual friend that in about 10, 20 years, I would come full circle to, he's just like Kennedy. It was all just a dream.
Yeah. And are you there?
Do you know what? I won't be there, but just because I refuse, because I feel like that's me accepting being old, and I refuse.
And cynicism as well, right? But there is something in it, definitely. There is something in it for sure. Not enough was done in those 8 years, for instance. It's like just not enough. Whereas on the other hand, if you and I find this really hard to say as someone who's extremely anti-war, but I now look back at New Labour and think that that was remarkable, particularly 97 to 2005. There was, you look at the state of what Britain would be if we hadn't rebuilt those schools and hospitals and we just accepted what had come before us, because we'd be talking about buildings that are now 40 years, 50 years out of date.
Wow.
So I do think, and the thing is, in Britain, our centralised system and the power that you can get if you win a general election does give us an advantage. It's a negative as well, because you can feel really disempowered because things are happening so far away from you and in such a small group of people. But at the same time, when it's doing something that you want to happen, which again is difficult because you can't win them all, and not everyone can have everything they want. But when progress is being made in Britain, it can happen really fast. Whereas the US just doesn't have the same levers to do that, really.
Yeah, I had on a staunch Obama critic to prove that, you know, I can talk to anyone, because I feel the biggest issue in America is that the two sides refuse. I don't know if it's because that's how they're incentivized to be.
No, I think you're right. It's impossible. I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that my wife's family are from Nebraska, and they represent that side of the political divide. And that means that I've had 10, 12 years of practice of really trying to understand. And I don't think many people do. As you were saying right at the beginning, like, there's this huge ghettoization in America in every sense, where you really don't have to leave your bubble unless you really, really try to. Whereas I feel like you might accidentally stumble into a conversation on the bus in London, because we actually have, you know, those public realms that don't really exist in car-driven America as well, I think.
Yeah, and our governments really encourage it, actually. Like, even just thinking right out during the pandemic, after the pandemic, like, a lot of London spaces had like free table tennis. And, you know, it's easy to take that for granted, but then just watching those spaces, and you see a tourist would play with a local kid, and it just...
Totally.
They don't have that, right? Like, and everyone's in their car in America. Everyone drives everywhere. So you don't really get to experience anything of American life.
No. Then the conversation is always, how do we activate our allies to vote? Or, you know, it's like, how do we have the best bubble, the most effective bubble? It's not, how do we cross the divide? How do we, you know, and there's this mysterious independent vote, which people fight over, which is tiny, which is the same in the UK, I guess, but it's so entrenched. It's got a long way to recovery, I think.
How did you, so in terms of gender roles, how have you managed so far? Is it with some help from family, some help from being able to afford, you know, extra help, nurseries, that kind of thing, that has really helped taper over any difficulties, right?
Yeah, I mean, initially while we were in London, it was very much having some brilliant women, immigrant women, inevitably as well, help us around the edges. Things like after school in the schools as well, I think, is a great system in the UK. Then my parents moved nearby, and then in the States, it's been hard. You know, I've left my parents behind. I don't have that flexibility. Things are more expensive over here, actually, as well. So it's tended to be me over here, sort of reducing my my work and providing that flexibility.
I would have thought DC would have a lot more help.
I think so, but it's extremely expensive, and also America believes that it's a cheaper, better place, but it's actually really bloody expensive. People can't believe it when I say that we're way worse off living in DC than in London, because people are like, but London's like the most expensive on the planet, and you're like, no, it's not totally true at all. It
was really, really nice talking to you, Dom.
Yeah, you too. I could do it all day, but really great to chat.
Yeah, well, hopefully when you come back next time, let's meet in person.
I'd love that. That'd be really cool.
Okay. Thank you, Dom. Speak soon.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.